The Valkyrians arrived on a Tuesday morning, their crystalline ships casting rainbow patterns across the sky above every major city on Earth. The world watched, entranced, as beings of ethereal beauty emerged from their vessels. Tall, luminescent humanoids with flowing silver hair and eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies. They called themselves peacekeepers, explorers seeking to share knowledge and technology with humanity. Dr. Rajesh Kumar, head of the United Nations First Contact Division, knew something was wrong from the moment he shook hands with High Commander Lazara. The touch left his mind buzzing with static, like television noise cranked to maximum volume. But protocol demanded diplomacy, and the world was too excited about the prospect of advanced alien technology to listen to one man's concerns. "Your species has such fascinating neural patterns," Lazara had commented during their first private meeting, her silver eyes fixed on Rajesh's face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. So chaotic, so full of potential. Within 3 months, the Valkyrians had established cultural exchange centers in every major city. They offered miraculous medical treatments, technological innovations, and most notably, consciousness expansion therapy that promised to unlock humanity's psychic potential. Millions volunteered for the treatments, eager to evolve beyond their human limitations. Juniper Rose, a homeless veteran who spent her nights in a shelter near one of the centers in Chicago, was among the few who noticed when people started changing. The volunteers emerged from their treatments with eerily peaceful expressions and vacant eyes. They spoke of unity and submission to a greater purpose, their voices flat and their movements mechanical. "They're not right anymore," Juniper whispered to her friend Thomas at the shelter's dinner table, watching a group of treated civilians walk past the window in perfect synchronization. "It's like they're empty inside." The truth revealed itself 6 months after first contact. Rajesh was working late at the UN headquarters when his computer screen flickered to life unbidden. Data streams from classified surveillance systems worldwide poured across his screen. Footage from inside the cultural exchange centers. He watched in horror as the truth about the consciousness expansion therapy unveiled itself. The Valkyrians weren't expanding human consciousness. They were harvesting it. Each treatment extracted another fragment of human awareness, transferring it to vast crystalline matrices hidden within their ships. The process left behind just enough consciousness for basic function, creating perfect, docile workers for their growing empire. But something unexpected was happening. The harvest was taking longer than the Valkyrians had anticipated. Humans were proving remarkably resistant to complete consciousness extraction. Their minds, shaped by generations of struggle, joy, pain, and triumph, fought back in ways the Valkyrians had never encountered. "High Commander," a junior Valkyrian officer reported, "we're seeing unprecedented levels of neural regeneration in the human subjects. Their consciousness, it grows back." Lazara's ethereal features twisted with frustration as she reviewed the data. In all their conquests across 12 galaxies, they had never encountered a species whose consciousness demonstrated such resilience. Human minds, it seemed, refused to stay broken. As the year drew to a close, the Valkyrians abandoned their pretense of benevolence. Their ships, once beautiful, now loomed like vast predatory crystals above Earth's cities. The consciousness harvesting became mandatory, enforced by floating drones that patrolled the streets, scanning for unprocessed humans. But in the shadows of this new world order, resistance was already taking shape. Juniper Rose, whose years of PTSD therapy had inadvertently made her mind too complex for the Valkyrians to easily process, began gathering others like her. Dr. Kumar, armed with his knowledge of the enemy's true nature, went underground to establish a network of safe houses, and in research laboratories hidden beneath the streets of cities worldwide. Human scientists worked frantically to understand the one thing that might save them all: the unique complexity of the human mind that made it so difficult for the Valkyrians to fully harvest. The war for human consciousness had begun, and humanity's greatest weapon would turn out to be the very thing the Valkyrians had hoped to steal: the beautiful, chaotic, resilient nature of the human spirit. The first clue that humanity wasn't as defenseless as the Valkyrians assumed came from an unexpected source. Meera Patel, a meditation instructor in Mumbai, had been teaching a class when the harvest drones arrived. Rather than fleeing, she and her students had simply continued their breathing exercises. The drone's consciousness extraction beams had washed over them harmlessly, leaving the Valkyrians baffled. "Impossible," snarled Commander Lazara, her crystalline form pulsing with angry red light as she reviewed the footage. No species has ever resisted the extraction process through mere mental discipline. But humans, as the Valkyrians were learning, had spent millennia developing various forms of mental resilience. Meditation practitioners, trauma survivors, individuals with neurodivergent conditions, all showed varying degrees of resistance to the harvesting process. The very challenges that humans had faced throughout their history had inadvertently prepared them for this invasion. In the underground resistance headquarters, Dr. Kumar studied the data collected from successful resistance cases. "It's not just about mental strength," he explained to Juniper Rose and their growing team of rebels. "It's about mental complexity. The Valkyrians' extraction process works by creating a sort of standardized pathway to consciousness. But human minds aren't standardized. We're too messy, too varied." Juniper nodded, thinking of her fellow veterans. "That's why they can't fully process people with PTSD or anxiety. Our brains are already rewired in ways they don't expect." The resistance began actively recruiting people who demonstrated natural resistance. Buddhist monks worked alongside anxiety sufferers, teaching them to harness their unique mental patterns. Depression survivors, whose minds had already learned to function under extreme cognitive stress, became valuable trainers in mental resilience. Meanwhile, in Seattle, a group of neuroscientists led by Dr. James Wilson made a breakthrough. The Valkyrians' consciousness extraction works like a key in a lock, he explained over encrypted channels to resistance cells worldwide. But human consciousness isn't a single lock. It's more like a constantly changing combination that even we don't fully understand. The discovery sparked a global underground movement. People began deliberately cultivating mental complexity through meditation, art, music, and even controlled chaos. The very aspects of human nature that the Valkyrians had initially dismissed as primitive, emotional volatility, psychological adaptation, creative expression, became humanity's shields. In their crystalline ships, the Valkyrians watched with growing unease as their harvest numbers dropped. Humans weren't just resisting, they were adapting. Each failed extraction attempt seemed to make nearby humans more resistant, as if the species was developing a collective psychological immune response. "Their neural patterns are evolving," reported a Valkyrian scientist, their form flickering with distress. "They're actually using our extraction attempts as training exercises to strengthen their mental barriers." The resistance grew bolder. Juniper led raids on harvesting centers, not just to free captives, but to expose more humans to low-level extraction attempts, helping them build immunity. Dr. Kumar worked with international teams to develop technologies that could detect and track Valkyrian energy signatures, using their own monitoring systems against them. But the most significant development came from an unexpected quarter. Children, with their naturally fluid and imaginative consciousness, proved almost completely immune to extraction. Their minds, unfettered by rigid patterns and filled with constant creative energy, were like quicksilver in the Valkyrians' grasp. "You can't take what you can't understand," laughed 8-year-old Zara, a refugee in one of the resistance safe houses, after effortlessly deflecting another extraction attempt. "And you don't understand anything about how we think." The Valkyrians had encountered resistance before, but never like this. Other species had fought with weapons, with technology, with psychic abilities. Humans fought with the very chaos of their existence, turning their psychological complexity into an impenetrable defense. In their command centers, the Valkyrians began to realize a terrifying truth. They hadn't discovered humanity's weakness by targeting their consciousness. They had inadvertently awakened humanity's greatest strength, their incredible capacity for psychological adaptation and growth under pressure. As spring turned to summer, the resistance received reports from around the globe. In Rio de Janeiro, samba dancers held consciousness-protecting street festivals. In Tokyo, Zen masters taught businessmen to create mental safe rooms. In Lagos, storytellers wove tales that helped children build natural psychic defenses. Humanity wasn't just surviving the invasion. They were turning it into an opportunity for unprecedented psychological evolution. The very attempt to harvest their consciousness had sparked a renaissance of human mental potential. And in her crystalline command ship, High Commander Lazara faced an uncomfortable realization. They had gravely miscalculated. They had assumed consciousness was something that could be cleanly extracted and contained. But human consciousness, they were learning, wasn't just a resource to be harvested. It was a living, growing, evolving force that became stronger with every attempt to contain it. In the depths of an abandoned subway station beneath Montreal, Dr. Wilson hunched over a makeshift laboratory bench, his eyes fixed on a peculiar device. It resembled a crystal radio set built by a mad scientist, with odd geometrical patterns etched into its surface that mimicked Valkyrian technology. But unlike their consciousness harvesting machines, this device did something entirely different. It amplified human mental patterns. The breakthrough came from understanding that we were thinking about consciousness all wrong. He explained to the assembled resistance leaders. We were trying to shield our minds, but what we really needed to do was broadcast them. The resistance had grown into a sophisticated global network. Underground bunkers were connected by old utility tunnels and forgotten Cold War infrastructure. People who had once been strangers now worked together with seamless efficiency. Gamers coordinating tactical operations, artists designing psychological warfare campaigns, and neuroscientists developing new ways to fight back. Juniper Rose, now commanding the North American Resistance Front, studied the device with skeptical eyes. You're saying we can turn our thoughts into weapons? Better, Wilson replied, powering up the machine. The air hummed with an almost subliminal frequency. We can turn our thoughts into a virus, one that infects their systems with human chaos. The Valkyrians had made a critical mistake in their invasion. By connecting so many human minds to their crystalline matrices, they had inadvertently created a network that could be used against them. Each harvested consciousness left an imprint, a pathway that could be followed back to its source. In New Delhi, Meera Patel worked with a team of programmers to develop what they called consciousness malware, packets of pure human experience designed to overwhelm Valkyrian systems. They seeded their programs with everything from childhood memories to dream fragments, from bursts of pure joy to moments of profound grief. The Valkyrians want order, Meera explained during a global resistance briefing. Their entire civilization is built on perfectly aligned crystalline structures. But human consciousness is anything but orderly. We're going to use that. The first major offensive came during a harvest attempt in Buenos Aires. As the Valkyrian drones moved in to process a crowd of civilians, the resistance activated their new weapons. Instead of attempting to block the consciousness extraction, they amplified it, flooding the Valkyrian systems with an overwhelming surge of human mental activity. The results exceeded their wildest expectations. The crystalline drones literally shattered, overwhelmed by the complexity and intensity of unfiltered human consciousness. In their ships above, Valkyrian operators reeled from the psychic backlash. They're not just resisting, reported a panicked Valkyrian technician, their form flickering with distress patterns never before seen in their species. They're infecting our entire network with feelings. The revolution spread rapidly after that. Resistance cells worldwide began using modified versions of Wilson's device, each adding their own cultural touches to the basic design. In Kenya, they incorporated traditional drumming patterns. In Iceland, they wove in ancient runes. Each variation seemed to make the technology more effective, more uniquely human. High Commander Lazara watched in mounting horror as her invasion force began to show signs of contamination. Valkyrian warriors were experiencing emotions for the first time in their species' history. Some began to question their mission. Others showed signs of developing individual personalities, a concept completely foreign to their hive mind-like civilization. "This is unprecedented," she reported to the Valkyrian High Council. "The humans aren't just fighting back. They're changing us on a fundamental level. Our warriors are beginning to dream." Dr. Kumar, monitoring Valkyrian communications from the Resistance headquarters, recognized the shift in their enemies' behavior. "They thought they could harvest our consciousness like a resource," he told his team. "Instead, they're learning what it actually means to be conscious." The underground revolution had become something more than a mere resistance movement. It was evolving into a crusade not just to defend human consciousness, but to demonstrate its true power. Every successful operation showed the Valkyrians more of what they had failed to understand about the species they had attempted to subjugate. In her private quarters, Juniper reviewed reports from around the world. Valkyrian drones were malfunctioning everywhere, their crystalline structures corrupted by exposure to raw human emotion. Some had even begun displaying behaviors that could only be described as creative expression, forming irregular patterns, emitting unusual frequencies that sounded almost like music. "They wanted to take our consciousness," she mused, watching footage of a Valkyrian ship attempting to create what appeared to be an abstract light sculpture. "Instead, we're teaching them what consciousness really is." The tide was turning, but the war was far from over. The Valkyrian High Command, frightened by the changes affecting their forces, began preparing for a final desperate offensive. They would rather destroy Earth entirely than risk further contamination by human consciousness. What they didn't realize was that humanity was preparing something even more revolutionary, a way to not just defeat the Valkyrians, but to help them evolve. The underground revolution was about to become an uprising of consciousness itself. The plan was both brilliant and insane. Exactly the kind of strategy that made humans so unpredictable. As dawn broke over the Himalayan mountains, Dr. Kumar stood in the Resistance's Global Command Center, addressing leaders from every continent via secure holographic links. "The Valkyrians' greatest weakness," he explained, gesturing to a complex diagram of crystalline structures, "is their perfect order. Their consciousness exists in pure geometric patterns, but we've proven that human chaos can shatter those patterns. Now we're going to take that concept to its logical extreme." The Resistance had discovered something extraordinary. The Valkyrians' harvested consciousness storage systems were actually part of a vast, interconnected network. Every ship, every drone, every crystal matrix was linked in a sort of collective quantum consciousness. It was this perfect synchronization that made them powerful and vulnerable. In Tokyo, Resistance technicians led by Dr. Naoko Yamamoto had reverse-engineered Valkyrian technology to create what they called consciousness amplifiers. These devices didn't just broadcast human thought patterns. They could focus the combined mental energy of thousands of minds into a coherent beam of pure human experience. "Think of it as a denial-of-service attack," Dr. Wilson explained, his hologram flickering slightly. "But instead of computer data, we're going to flood their network with everything that makes us human. Our dreams, our fears, our hopes, our love, our anger. Everything they tried to harvest and control." Juniper Rose, who had been coordinating with guerrilla teams worldwide, spoke up. "The hard part won't be generating the mental energy. It'll be getting close enough to their main ships to use it effectively." She was right. The Valkyrians had withdrawn their ground forces after the first wave of consciousness contamination, relying instead on orbital bombardment and automated drones. Their massive crystalline ships now hung in high orbit, seemingly out of reach. But humanity had been preparing for this moment. In secret facilities around the world, engineers had been retrofitting experimental spacecraft with consciousness amplifiers. Test pilots, chosen for their exceptional mental resilience, had been trained to operate these hybrid vessels that were part machine, part psychic broadcaster. The first phase of the counter-strike began with a feint. Resistance cells worldwide launched simultaneous attacks on Valkyrian ground installations, using conventional weapons alongside smaller consciousness amplifiers. The Valkyrians, their tactical algorithms still based on traditional warfare, responded predictably by repositioning their fleet to optimize orbital strike capabilities. That's when the true attack began. From hidden bases in the Atacama Desert, the Siberian tundra, and the Australian outback, humanity's new hybrid fighters took to the skies. Each carried not just weapons, but the focused mental energy of thousands of volunteers who had literally poured their minds into the consciousness amplifiers. Remember, Juniper broadcast to the pilots, "Don't try to fight their perfection with perfection. Fight it with everything that makes us beautifully imperfect." The battle that followed defied conventional description. As the human fighters engaged the Valkyrian fleet, they'd broadcast not just tactical data but pure, raw consciousness. Artists transmitted their creative chaos. Children shared their unbridled imagination. Musicians projected their harmonies and discords. The effect on the Valkyrian ships was catastrophic. Their perfect crystalline structures began to resonate with unwanted frequencies, their flawless geometric patterns disrupted by the sheer complexity of human thought. Ships that had survived asteroid impacts started to crack under the strain of processing human emotions. High Commander Lizara watched in horror as her fleet began to transform. Some ships started generating unpredictable energy patterns, their crystals refracting light in ways that created stunning, chaotic auroras. Others began moving in irregular patterns, as if dancing to some unheard rhythm. "Stop this immediately," she commanded, but even as she spoke, she felt her own consciousness beginning to change. The human thoughts flooding their network weren't just attacking. They were teaching, sharing, showing the Valkyrians a kind of existence they had never imagined possible. In orbit above Earth, reality itself seemed to bend as human consciousness collided with Valkyrian order. The hybrid fighters, piloted by humans who had learned to embrace both chaos and control, ducked and weaved through the crystalline fleet, broadcasting wave after wave of pure human experience. But the most extraordinary moment came when a young pilot named Kai, their fighter damaged and systems failing, made a desperate decision. Instead of ejecting, they opened their mind completely, broadcasting not just controlled thoughts but their entire being, their fears, their determination, their hope for survival, their acceptance of possible death. The nearest Valkyrian ship, instead of destroying the vulnerable fighter, began to resonate with Kai's consciousness. Then another ship joined, and another. The previously perfect crystalline network began to pulse with something new: empathy. Dr. Kumar, monitoring the battle from the ground, watched in amazement as the tactical displays showed something unprecedented. The Valkyrian ships were changing formation, not to attack, but to create patterns that somehow reflected both their crystalline nature and human chaos. "They're not just being corrupted by our consciousness," he realized. "They're learning to integrate it. They're evolving." The counterstrike had become something far more significant than a mere military operation. It was becoming a revolution in consciousness itself, and its effects would reshape not just Earth's future, but the very nature of both species involved. The transformation of the Valkyrian fleet marked not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of something far more profound. As the crystalline ships hung in Earth's orbit, their surfaces now rippling with ever-changing patterns of light and color, both species stood at the threshold of an unprecedented evolution. High Commander Lizara, her form now a shifting kaleidoscope of crystalline facets rather than the rigid geometric patterns of before, requested a direct meeting with the human resistance leadership. The location chosen was symbolic: a neutral space station hastily constructed in low Earth orbit, its design incorporating both Valkyrian crystalline architecture and human organic curves. Dr. Kumar, Juniper Rose, and Dr. Wilson represented humanity, while Lizara brought her most transformed officers. The meeting chamber itself became a visual representation of their clash and eventual synthesis: crystal walls that pulsed with human emotions, floors that shifted between perfect patterns and creative chaos. "We came to harvest your consciousness," Lizara began, her voice carrying new harmonics of emotion that would have been impossible for her species before. "We thought consciousness was a resource to be collected, quantified, and stored. We were wrong. It's not a resource. It's a living, growing force." Juniper, who had fought the Valkyrians from the first day of their invasion, studied their changed forms with a mixture of wariness and wonder. "You didn't just want to take our consciousness," she observed. "You needed it. Your species had reached the limits of what perfect order could achieve." The truth emerged through their dialogue. The Valkyrians had evolved to their crystalline form through eons of pursuing perfect order, structure, and harmony. But this pursuit had led them to a dead end, unable to grow, change, or truly create anything new. They had begun harvesting consciousness from other species in a desperate attempt to continue their evolution. But human consciousness was different, Dr. Wilson explained, reviewing data from both species. "We never evolved toward perfect order. We evolved to embrace chaos, to find strength in our contradictions. Our consciousness isn't a static pattern. It's a dynamic process." The breakthrough came when Dr. Kumar suggested a radical possibility. What if, instead of trying to harvest consciousness, we shared it? Not as a resource to be taken, but as a way of growing together. The proposal was unprecedented. Using modified versions of the consciousness amplifiers, they could create a controlled exchange of experience between humans and Valkyrians, not to change or dominate each other, but to learn and evolve together. The first experiments were small-scale. Human volunteers and Valkyrian subjects shared brief mental connections, exchanging glimpses of their different ways of experiencing reality. The results were extraordinary. Humans gained access to new levels of mental organization and clarity, while Valkyrians experienced the liberating power of emotional complexity and creative chaos. Meera Patel, working with a team of human and Valkyrian scientists, developed what she called consciousness bridges, technologies that allowed for safe, controlled sharing of mental experiences between the species. "We're not just making peace," she explained. "We're creating a new way for consciousness itself to evolve." The changes spread rapidly through both populations. Humans who participated in the exchange developed remarkable new abilities to organize and control their thoughts, while maintaining their creative chaos. Valkyrians began to express themselves in ways that would have been impossible before, their crystalline forms becoming works of living art. Cities on Earth began to change as the two species learned to coexist. Crystalline structures grew alongside human architecture, not in rigid patterns but in flowing, organic forms that responded to the emotions of those nearby. The cultural exchange centers, once tools of harvesting, became true places of learning and growth. High Commander Lizara, in her final report to the Valkyrian High Council, wrote, "We came to Earth believing we were superior beings who had transcended the mess of emotions and individual consciousness. Instead, we found a species that had mastered something we have forgotten, the art of growing through imperfection." The resolution of the conflict became known throughout the galaxy, not as a victory of one species over another, but as the Great Synthesis, a moment when two fundamentally different forms of consciousness learn not just to coexist, but to help each other evolve. Years later, Juniper stood with Lizara on an observation deck, watching Earth below. The planet now sparkled with a perfect blend of human cities and Valkyrian crystals, while in orbit, ships of both species danced in formations that were both mathematical and artistic. "We thought we were fighting for survival," Juniper mused, "but we were really fighting for the right to grow, to change, to become something more than we were." Lizara's crystalline form shimmered with what humans had taught her to recognize as joy. "And in trying to change us, you changed too." Perhaps that's the true nature of consciousness, not a battle between order and chaos, but a dance between them. The story of the human-Valkyrian conflict became a legend across the cosmos, not as a tale of warfare, but as proof that even the most fundamental differences could be transformed into sources of strength. Earth became known not as the planet that defeated the Valkyrians, but as the birthplace of a new understanding of consciousness itself, one that would continue to evolve, grow, and transform for generations to come.